Everyone. Today we're going to tell you a little story combining a lot of things, some juicy things you guys would be interested in. Let me ask you this question first. Who in here has heard of Enron? Perfect. And to those who don't, you're going to learn a lot about Enron. Enron was an interesting case of fraud. And a lot of things that we're going to uncover for those who do, who have heard of Enron, is a lot of the ways that's affecting companies today and kind of the effect that it's had. We're going to talk about deregulation, we're going to talk about company culture, and we're going to talk where to draw that line between short-term profits and sustainability, kind of what that Nobel Prize winner was kind of doing research on. So here we start out in Texas. And in Texas, we're going to talk about the term Enronomics and the Enron illusion. And why Enron got its start in Texas? Because there's a lot of oil rigs there. That's how they got their start. They got their start in energy. And once they became more successful, they were able to build a massive skyscraper in Houston, Texas. So let's go to Houston, Texas. We got the Enron skyscraper right here. And what really is Enron? Well, Enron was the largest company in energy trading and utilities at the time. And this is pretty new, trading utilities as electricity and bandwidth. In addition, they went from building oil wells to trading energy products, things that we really haven't seen before. They were formed in 1985 with a merger between Houston Gas and Enron Incorporated, and they had a lot of this perceived massive success. And they were thought to be, at the time, the smartest in the room. How else could a company grow so quickly and become the most invested company in Wall Street? So they were perceived as so smart that in 2001 they actually created their own award to be given at a university, at Rice University, and this is called the Enron Distinguished Person Award. And the Janet Yellen of the time, the Fed Reserve chair, actually got the Enron Award in 2001. And to kind of give you guys a little layout, a little timeline, from 1996 to 2001, Enron was named the most innovative company 6 years in a row by Fortune magazine. In addition, they were voted the best company to work for those 6 years in a row. Interestingly enough, the worst company to work for at that time was Trump Hotels. And so for those 6 years were really great. And on December 2nd, 2001, Enron instantly went bankrupt. This was a month after they gave this award to Alan Greenspan. And what's interesting about this is how a company with such a large of a stock hike can become bankrupt. Even during the tech bubble, they were still rising, can become bankrupt so quickly. And this points instantly to some sort of scandal and perhaps an illusion that Enron is putting out that they're really doing better than they are, which is usually referred to as a black box. And The Simpsons talked a lot about this. Simpsons had a lot of episodes concerning Enron because it was pretty big. And Homer here decided to take all the Enron stock back in 2000. He gave Marge on the Microsoft stock. This is a very bad decision because soon after, Homer went and rode the Enron's ride of broken dreams, along with a lot of other employees, unfortunately, that worked there. And some of those employees, or some of the people who were involved, were these guys here. In order of appearance and order needed to keep up this illusion that we'll talk about a little bit more later. The first one was Kenneth Lay. He was called Kenny Boy by his wife and actually the Bush administration. He was very close with George W. Bush. And he was a poor farm boy. He doesn't seem like a person who'd get caught up in greed. He went to go get his PhD in economics, and one of the things that he really fought for were free markets and deregulation. And interestingly enough, he fought for a lot of the deregulation of the California's electricity. And later with Enron, he went and bought Portland General Electric. Now this is very interesting. We'll talk a lot about that later, so keep that in mind if you bought that. Next is Jeffrey Skilling. He was a CEO and then CEO at the time. He came from Harvard Business School. Now he came out of Harvard Business School with a lot of ideas Enron needed to keep up this illusion. And one of those was market-to-market accounting, which we'll talk about later, and a new employee review system that's quite interesting. And to kind of give you an intro to his psyche, Jeffrey Skilling in Harvard Business School was asked by a professor, "Hey Jeffrey, do you consider yourself a smart boy?" And this last point here was his response to that. So you can kind of see he was an extremely confident man. And one of his favorite books actually was Richard Dawkins' Gene Theory. And that was basically talking about the smartest person, the most strongest person gets the most mates. So that's very interesting. Keep that in mind when we talk about his employee review system. And that book is called The Selfish Gene. And the last person is Andrew Fastow. And Andrew Fastow was the CFO and he was a master of hide and seek. And by that I mean the master of hiding losses in subsidiary companies, which we'll talk about later. So after this Enron illusion was shattered, after the stock price dropped so low, just to kind of give you a quick little overview, the company closed at 26 cents a share from around 90 and around a couple of days. Also, $1.2 billion of retirement was immediately lost amongst all workers. As you can imagine, Bernie Sanders about had an aneurysm and immediately went to C-SPAN the next day with hair still not combed because he didn't get sleep that night. So this changed the landscape of the business world profoundly. And for one, before Enron, and unfortunately a lot of people in Enron, put all of their 401k into the Enron stock. Now, anyone would tell you don't do this now. Before Enron, that was done. And unfortunately, a lot of workers rode Enron's ride of broken dreams because they put their entire retirement into one company's stock. And this kind of impact, this impact that left on Wall Street in America, is termed under Enronomics. This is a term that was developed kind of by Investopedia, and that's kind of the title of our presentation, something that we're going to look into. Now, you're probably all wondering how. How exactly did they keep their prices so high, their stock prices so high, and how exactly did they keep this Enron illusion up? And Victoria is going to discuss some of the Enronomics behind this.
So what I'm going to focus on is basically the accounting fraud and the different types of fraud that both senior execs but all levels of the company took place in to create this illusion for Enron. So starting off and just creating the illusion, getting to the $90 stock price, the person who basically did this in terms of the top execs was Jeffrey Skilling, and he was the COO of Enron at the time. And what he did was he used mark-to-market accounting, which is Enron would build a factory and then they would predict what their earnings were going to be. They write that on their balance sheet under their assets, even though they haven't gotten any profit in from that factory. And then they were supposed to correct whatever that was in the future. So if they made more, they would add more to their assets. Less, they'd have to put that under losses. So just as a feeler, does anyone see a problem with using mark-to-market accounting? Because what you're doing is you're basically using metrics to predict what you might make off of something and then putting that immediately under your profit so you can have that in your stock price. Anyone? Yeah.
And I guess it can all go away really quickly.
Yeah. So basically what happened with Enron was they overestimated a lot of their profits and had huge losses that they decided not to report on their balance sheet. But one interesting thing is they had an independent accounting firm that they were working with, which was Arthur Andersen. And at the time, this was one of the most reputable accounting firms in the United States. There are top 5 accounting firms, and they were known for having really thorough work and high quality work. And they put their stamp of approval on Enron's accounting, which made people not look into the stock price. So if you know how stock price is calculated, you take the profits of a company and divide it by the number of shares outstanding. So in terms of Enron, they were really focused on making sure that they appeared at least to have very high profits so that they could have very high stock prices. So after they got to the height of their stock price, they had to maintain this illusion that Enron was making a ton of money, and that's when they hired Andrew Pastel and appointed him as CFO of Enron. And what he did was he used special purpose entities, or SPEs, to hide losses. So what he did was he created a ghost company, name it something stupid like Raptor, and he put a ton of debt in it or a ton of losses, and then he'd put Enron stock in it. So at least whichever investment bank was going to buy it, they'd have Enron stock to give it some sort of security. But what he failed to do was disclose to investment banks that it was both Enron stock and Enron debt, which is a conflict of interest, and you're not supposed to do that because you're effectively claiming that you have no debt and no loss, but you're giving losses and debts to investment banks. And this also had the stamp of Arthur Andersen on it. So most people also didn't know that these different SPs were connected to each other, but if you look at their accounting, you have Enron in the top left-hand corner, and then all of their SPEs listed underneath of them, and they all contained debt and loss from, and toxic acids also was what they were trading in these SPEs. But that still didn't keep their profits and their stock prices high, so their final attempt was just flat out wire fraud. And wire fraud is when you cut off something that's needed to sustain life to a community, so cutting off water, electricity, those types of things, to bid up the price. And because they owned Portland General Electric, which was a monopoly in California, they were able to cut off electricity to all of California and bid up the price of electricity. And they got caught pretty quickly because it's pretty obvious when you're committing such a outrageous type of wire fraud. And they also documented it pretty well for investigators, so they had emails, phone conversations that were all recorded that were basically them laughing on the phone about cutting off electricity to a whole state. So they started getting investigated, and it was just the tip of the iceberg. So the SEC started questioning the validity of profits for Enron, because why would a company need to commit wire fraud if they had such high profits? And when they started doing that, their stock price started to fall. So Enron did some things that were pretty sketchy, one of which was they forced their employees to hold on to their stock. So they changed their pension plan so they couldn't sell stock at a high, which is why a lot of them got screwed over later on when you look at all the amounts of money they lost in their 401ks. That's because they had to sell out at 26 cents per share rather than 90 cents or $90. And a few other things happened. So when stock price started to fall, their merger that they had planned with a company called Denji was backed out, and that just sent the stock into a complete free fall because people knew that something was going on. The SEC finished their investigation, and they asked Enron, or demanded that Enron go back to 1997 and revise all their profits. And what you found was they had undocumented losses of $591 million and debts of $628 million that were never mentioned on their balance sheets. So if you look, these are two stock tickers. This one is just of the downfall. This one is of a 6-year period. No, it's much longer than that, but whatever. But you can see that it was a pretty rapid increase in price of stock. The high was 90. And an even faster drop in terms of the stock price, and it eventually closed at 26 cents per share. So if you've taken 351 with Chud, I'll be Chud for a second. If you could predict this happening, you could have made a lot of money off of Enron stock by shorting it, but most people had a ton of faith in Enron as a company and just never thought to do that. So in terms of the financial impact of what this bankruptcy and what this fraud did was 20,000 employees lost their jobs, and their average severance pay was $4,500, so almost nothing. But the top execs were paid out $55 million, so they made out pretty well. There's $1.2 billion in retirement funds lost and $2 billion in pension funds lost. And slightly weird, but top execs took part in investment fraud and insider trading right before the stock price started to fall. So they were taking advantage of special stock options that no one else had access to, and they made $116 million before the stock completely went into free fall from stock options. So now that you understand kind of the accounting and the fraud that took place, Trevor's going to talk about like the corporate setting and the environment that caused people to make such radical decisions.
Looks like we've lost our background music, unfortunately. So now that you have an understanding of how Enron was able to build up this illusion, we're going to sort of take a step back and look at how they were able to foster these corporate values that sort of incentivized high risk-taking and possibly unethical behavior. And the story really starts with these three gentlemen right here. Following the SEC's investigations, Mr. Kenneth Lay on the left there was charged with 8 counts of criminal activity. Jeffrey Skilling in the middle was charged with 35. Mr. Fastow on the right kind of got the short end of the stick. He was charged with 90 accounts ranging from wire fraud to insider trading. So the story really starts with these guys, and we're going to take a look at how the ethics of these guys sort of trickle down to all levels of the corporation. Enron at the time had this motto, do it right, do it now, and do it better. That really signifies how they promoted this environment of extreme competition at the firm. They sort of set up incentives in a way that rewarded high risk-taking. They would pay people high bonuses for taking on large amounts of risk, not really caring about how they got to where they did. And it's really these ethics that trickle down through all levels of the firm, because it wasn't just these three guys making unethical decisions. It was really a whole firm effort. Really the man behind it was Jeffrey Skilling, who sort of promoted this decentralized corporate structure where people in lower levels of the company wouldn't really get a bigger picture sense of what they were doing. This made it a lot easier for people to sort of make small decisions that sort of snowballed into what we saw with Victoria. And Jeffrey Skilling also implemented this new employee review system, which Connor alluded to earlier, which became known as rank and yank. And in that system, every year, every employee would be ranked through various metrics and peer reviews. And ultimately, the bottom performing fifth in every division would be fired. So again, fostering this highly competitive work environment. And if you imagine yourself as an employee at Enron at the time, you're working for a company whose profits are built on this illusion, and you're expected to perform to that level. So it's kind of understandable how certain good people could be prompted to commit unethical decisions in that kind of environment. Now obviously Enron is the extreme case, but it sort of calls into question where we draw the line between short-term profits and long-term sustainability. We're always taught in our introductory econ courses that firms seek to maximize profits, but there isn't really a distinction drawn between short-term and long-term profits. Obviously Enron's the extreme case, but it sort of raises some questions that are still pertinent today. And Ryan's going to take a look at some developments that have taken place since then, and along with some other companies that have fallen into similar strategies.
Okay, so as Trevor said, the ultimate goal of any business is to maximize profits, and we know this. And especially in the short term, when pushed to extremes, this can lead to some pretty shady behavior. So Enron wasn't the first to do this. We're going to talk about my man Hedge Stratos. He was a Greek merchant, 300 BC, sold corn, and the OG insurance fraudster, if you will. He took out an insurance policy on a ship, took the cargo off the ship, intended to sink it, with his crew still on the ship, to cash out on the corn and the insurance policy. Now, unfortunately, they caught him. He tried to escape, he drowned, and that was that. But thought that was worth looking at. Now, fast forward a couple thousand years, right? We've all heard this song. I've been getting dirty money, Jordan Belfort, stacking all these penny stocks while I'm flipping these birds. Now, what does that refer to? Pump and dump. So what is pump and dump? It starts out with the company acquiring stake, typically in a smaller company, because it offers greater capital appreciation, inflating the price artificially, typically through spreading false news, false good news. That was the case for Enron and also for Stratton Oakmont. And then selling as soon as the price responds to this for the capital appreciation, right? And even back then, this was highly illegal, and the SEC didn't appreciate it. They caught them and sentenced Jordan Belfort to 4 years in prison. I don't need to remember that moving forward. And then finally, waste management. What they were was basically the Enron before Enron, okay? So through a laundry list, pretty much any accounting fraud you could imagine, they inflated earnings by 1.7 billion over a few year period. Now, all that came of this was a class action lawsuit. They were forced to pay $500 million. Their CEO stepped down. $500 million wasn't that much to him, if you were wondering. He had a pretty good life after that. And that was that. So now I'm going to talk about the effects of Enron in both the business landscape and socially. We're going to think about trends and maybe some similarities about fraud sense and also ways it has changed. So most importantly, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. So that has been basically called a mirror of all of the legislative and regulatory shortcomings that let Enron get away with what it got away with for so long. So, among its provisions, most importantly, executives were forced to sign off on accounting and financial documents so that they couldn't feign ignorance, such as the Enron executives did. Also, any off-the-balance sheet transaction had to be disclosed, and what that does is doesn't allow companies to hide bad debt in subsidiaries, again, like Enron did. And then, finally, stricter sentencing. Now, if you think about how they got sentenced before, except maybe Hedger Stratos because he's around and died. But just think about 4 years Jordan Belfort, no years Waste Management, and that was pretty much almost as bad as Enron, arguably. Now let's talk about the sentences the Enron executives got. Kenneth Fastel got let off the easiest. He had a lot of charges, as Charlie said, but he got 6 years in prison because he cooperated and, you know, like pleaded guilty and didn't really give him a hard time. Then you have Jack Skilling, who was given 24 years, and then you have Kenneth Lay, who would have been sentenced to up to 45 years. He died of a heart attack in his vacation house in Aspen before sentencing. Fortunately for him, if you ask me, because, I mean, just looking at him, 45 years is a lot of time not to drop the soap in prison. I don't really trust his odds against most inmates. But that's neither here nor there. So now, let's talk about fraud since Enron, and see if we can draw some parallelisms to Enron, and also see how the aftermath of Enron changed them. So, starting at WorldCom, a telecommunications company, they inflated assets by $11 billion in a similar way Enron did. And actually, at $11 billion, they dethroned Enron months later as the biggest scandal in history. And this is probably due to deregulation characteristic of the period. And let's think about why. So just like in Enron, and any public company, you're faced with quarterly and yearly expectations for earnings, right? Because that's what directly controls the price of your stock. So one bad quarter, your stock price goes down. Another, you start to snowball, and before you know it, your company goes under. So that's not really an option. So instead, it's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle. They get behind one quarter, they have to fabricate these profits to make up for it. Now they're in debt starting next quarter, but they are supposed to be profiting. They come up short again, do the same thing. Before you know it, it's $11 billion. And that's what we saw with Enron as well. So Bernie Ebbers, the CEO, was sentenced to 25 years in prison, obviously drastically different than previously before this Enron scandal. And then Tyco, similarly, months after that, they were a security company. And what the CEOs did, CFO, was generate $500 million in fake income, and from that, they directly stole 150, pocketed it themselves. And that's really easy to see how, once again, corporate greed, in the case of Enron, and then in the case of Tyco, led to their undoing. They're both sentenced to 8 to 25 years in prison, and again, you can see the difference. It's pretty clear. And there's a lot of other instances of frauds that I could talk about, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip to Wells Fargo. You might have seen them in the news recently. Could someone tell me why? Anybody? Anybody watch the news in here? Yeah. So they created fake accounts under existing customers. Sorry. And currently 5,300 employees have been terminated for this. And again, thinking back to Enron, what might motivate an employee to do something like this? And that would be the cutthroat culture you saw in Enron with their rank and yank system. Wells Fargo obviously had pretty stringent quotas for performance that had to be fulfilled. And the employees were just, in their eyes, protecting their livelihood, right? So with that being said, I think you realize that although legislation and regulation has changed a lot since Enron and will continue to do so, a lot of the reasons underlying this fraud has stayed the same. So I think that begs the question, can you ever eliminate fraud entirely? And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Connor to wrap it up, and we'll go into discussion.
Okay, guys, who right now is Bernie level triggered? Anyone? Is anyone angry about this? If you're not, you probably have something to do with this. You have some money in some big fraudulent companies. But basically, what we talked about today, we talked about this idea of Enronomics, or this idea of the Enron illusion, was perpetuated through things like deregulation in the government, corporate culture, and is still pervasive today within our corporate structure. So this offers a lot of questions. And the first question that we want to provide to you guys, kind of to start a discussion, was it a few evil people that did this, like these Kenneth Blaze, or is it the system itself? And what are some of the issues there? What do you guys think?
I think at the top it's a few evil people that know exactly what they're doing.